Okay, so for part two, we're going to get into indicating on the lathe. And as we know, the milling machine, you do all your indicating by either moving the indicator or moving the part back and forth in a direction, a lineal sort of motion. Go to one end, back to the other, move the part, try it again. Eventually you get there. With the lathe, of course, the part rotates. So being a circle, you can come back to your starting point. You don't have to roll it one way and then roll it back the other way. You just keep rolling it around and around and around. And every time you come back to that same point, you'll soon notice that you have one high point and one low point, and you adjust accordingly, and it all works out good. Sometimes this is a very good thing, and sometimes it's not so good if you're trying to sort of look outside the box. Let's say you get trapped into a way of thinking, either because you're on a mill or because you're on a lathe. You don't consider perhaps using the one technique on the other. So here's part two. Now this brings us to another type of indicating, which is over here on the lathe. And these being our two most common tools in the machine shop, the lathe and the milling machine. Most of the techniques on either of these two machines can be adapted or used directly on other machines or types of operations. So you know, a lot of what you end up doing is just putting a part in the chuck and then truing up your part in the chuck. So we've got that motion of the chuck revolving, and we've got an indicator bearing against the part, and that'll tell us how it's set up in this plane. And then you can dial it in, and that'll get it so that the outside diameter of that part is then concentric with the rotation of the spindle at that point. Doesn't mean that the part is necessarily true in the lathe bed. It'll tell you that the part is concentric at that point at which you're indicating, which generally is right handy to the chuck because you're using a 4-jaw chuck, and that's why you're indicating. If you're using a scroll chuck, like a 3-jaw chuck, chances are you're not going to bother indicating, because if you do, you're going to be depressed as to the results that you get, and you're going to run out and buy a true adjust chuck and end up spending thousands of dollars that you don't have. More on this, and hopefully some of you just jumped out of your seats there and said, hey, wait a minute, you forgot to mention that's true. Doesn't matter what type of chuck you have, but predominantly scroll chucks, like 3-jaw chucks, that the jaws move in, you know, automatically, coordinated together by a mechanical linkage kind of idea or mechanical means. If you either grind your chuck into perfection and or use soft jaws, that'll solve the slight run out that you might have in your chuck. If you've got a good mounting style and it's clean, you got a good quality chuck, it'll be pretty good. It'll be good enough for most of the work you do. But if you're after high precision, you're going to have to go slightly above the sort of entry level, and that would involve things like either a true adjust, where you can actually move the entire chuck around on its mount, or again the soft jaws, because you're boring them into concentricity with the rotational axis of the spindle. I'm sure there's something I missed there, but there's all kinds of other awesome videos on YouTube that you can find about that. And when it comes to soft jaws, I am the last guy you should listen to, because for whatever reason we've just never got into using them in any of the shops that I worked at. So here we'll move on along. Heavens to Betsy, we'll get there eventually. But soft jaws, I know, because everybody said, well, what is he talking about? These are hard jaws. They're one piece, and soft jaws, generally speaking, they'll have a master jaw, which will be just like this, only it'll be one specific height, and it will not have any grip features on it, or if it does, they'll be generally insufficient to do any meaningful work with it. And it'll have mounting holes where you can attach a top jaw, and there's all different kinds of shapes and styles you can buy and or make, and you screw or bolt that top jaw onto the master jaw, and quite often you end up boring your top jaws and or turning the OD so that you can grip parts very accurately, and it allows you to also mill in a depth, or turn a depth stop into the face of the jaw, so when you're machining small parts, they more or less index or reference against that feature that you've just created in the soft jaw. And you know, for anything that you're doing more than one of, soft jaws can just be an awesome sort of thing to use. But again, we just so rarely are we doing anything in a production sort of setting in the shop that we've managed to live without it. And only one of the 4 chucks that's at my disposal has 2-piece jaws. All right, so there we have our part, which is stuck through the lathe spindle like so. And we've got a dial indicator there. We've got it more or less indicated into our 4-jaw chuck. It's running at about 1/1000th run out. So that's great. That's the run out right there. It'll be a different run out there, and of course it's a different one. Here's the exact same setup. We just moved the dial indicator to the other end of the lathe, so there it is. Nice and true right there. Just have to take my word for it. And there's the other end. We've got the dial indicator attached to the steel cabinet of the lathe, and we're indicating against the shaft, and that's a lot of motion. So that bar in the headstock, of course, is, you know, off to, it's not in there true, it's cocked over one side. Because we've got this spider on the far end of our spindle, we can use these machine screws to force that back into near perfection. Just wind the screws in there and indicate it just like we would a 4-jaw, and that'll get this end of the bar running concentric with the axis of the spindle in this location. Then we go back and we double check here, because if this was crooked and we've got that zeroed in, when we straighten it out, it's going to quite likely be in a different, it'll no longer be concentric to that rotational axis again. So you have to bounce back and forth a couple of times until you're happy with the level of perfection that you've got it. And then when you come in here to do some work, and let's say you put a center hole, a center drill feature in here, or you're going to end drill or whatever, that's when the part will actually be running concentric with the spindle, so that when you put that feature in there, it's actually in the center of the shaft. Otherwise, you dive in there and it's going to be not right. Depending on the tooling you're using, it's going to make an oversized hole, and or you'll end up boring a hole on a sort of bent axis into the part, which is really inconvenient if you're doing more than one step, or even if you're doing one big step, that can be disastrous. So especially if you have to take the part out, do some work, turn it around, put it back in, the next time you go in there to get at that hole, it's almost impossible to, there are ways to do it, but it's very difficult to get that randomly created sort of bent axis feature back in line with the spindle so you can carry on work with it. So we got this down to about 1/1000th now. I really should have set up 2 dial indicators for this, but it just occurred to me, so we'll just make do with the one. So after we got that far end down to 1/1000th, look what we got here now. We're almost up to 4.5, 5, so we'll re-zero that. So as usual, I managed to lose some of the video that was supposed to go in there next, but you'll get the idea. So we worked at each end alternately. I can't remember how many times we adjusted each end. Not very many. I think we did this end 2 or 3 times, the other end at least twice. So somewhere between 4 and 6 sort of adjustments. I'm pretty sure it was 5. And you know, we've got this running nice and true here now. It's well under a half thou. That's a half thou resolution on there, so that's very good. And likewise at the far end here, it's plenty close enough. So that gets it centered up at each end of the headstock spindle. So this bar, provided it's not bent, will project outward, and it'll be concentric as it extends away from the headstock there, the chuck. So when we do things like face the part, that face will actually be 90 degrees to the shaft. And if we put a center feature in there, like we've put a center drilled hole, that should be dead center of, or as close as we care to make it, in that shaft. So if we set it up out running on a live center in the tailstock, it should be running true. It won't have a lopsided or eccentric motion to it. And that's certainly the the proof is in the pudding. When you think you center drilled it nicely and you stick it out 4 or 5 feet out away from the lathe chuck and put a live center in it, and then you discover that you forgot to double check something and your part's wobbling all over the place and you haven't got enough material left on it to make it true again. It can end up for either some unintended overtime or a long weekend or some hurt feelings.